you.
Thank you, David. I'd like to introduce to everybody David Rose. David is Politics and Investigations Editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and he previously worked for national and international media organisations, including The Guardian, The Observer, Vanity Fair, Mail on Sunday, and BBC TV Current Affairs. Defending human rights and revealing their abuse has been the dominant theme of his career. He did groundbreaking investigative work on the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, the Tottenham 3 miscarriages of justice cases, on Guantanamo Bay and other aspects of the war on terror, and on the death penalty. His TV work includes The Spying Game, a series that exposed the former Soviet atom bomb spy, Melita Norwood. His awards include the One World European Union Human Rights Journalism Prize, the Royal Institute of International Affairs David Watt Memorial Prize, the Trento Mountain Literature Grand Prize, and the Bar Council Award for Legal Journalist of the Year. He's been shortlisted 7 times in the British National Press Awards and is a past winner in both the Reporter of the Year and Feature Writer of the Year categories. David is the author of 6 non-fiction books, and he also was shortlisted for the UK Crime Writers Association Golden Dagger, and his novel, Taking Morgan, is a thriller set in Washington, Tel Aviv, and the Gaza Strip, and draws on his extensive reporting experience in both America and the Middle East. The investigation he's going to tell you about took place in July 2022, and his 3 major articles reporting on this were published at the end of August and beginning of September. We were really pleased to partner with David and the Jewish Chronicle to enable this investigation to happen. We've used his investigation to report back extensively. We've written to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, to government ministers and the Secretary of State. We've forwarded his findings and engaged with Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel and the Britain-Israel All-Party Group on this work. And just recently, in the middle of November, we held a briefing in Parliament where David came in, and in a packed room full of MPs, peers and senior think tankers, David outlined the findings of this investigation. I'm really pleased now to say that he's going to do the same here to us today. So David, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Can I start then by asking you a broad question? If you could describe to us the project and give everyone an account of what the plan was and what you did.
Yes, well, I have touched on human rights abuses by the Palestinian Authority earlier in my career. And so it's not an unfamiliar theme to me, but I felt that it seemed there was evidence that there was something of a crisis of legitimacy building up more generally in the PA, and to take the opportunity to spend at least a couple of weeks on the ground reporting for the Jewish Chronicle for a series of articles would be very worthwhile. This was a relatively expensive exercise because, of course, it required going to and staying in what is not a cheap country for UK visitors because of the rather poor pound-shekel exchange rate. And of course, I needed a driver and fixer to move freely around the West Bank, somebody who had excellent Palestinian contacts, well, indeed, herself a Palestinian, you know, sympathetic to the overall thrust of the project. Well, fortunately, I do have a long-standing colleague and fixer who I've used over the last 15 years or so in trips to the region, but she doesn't come cheap either. Anyway, the Jewish Chronicle is not an enormously rich newspaper, and so it was with some gratitude that we accepted support from FELNET to finance part of the cost of this trip. And of course, FELNET has been invaluable in trying to increase the impact of what I was able to write. I did eventually fill over 11,000 words of space in the paper over 3 weeks, looking at the different aspects of my investigation. But I think having the meeting that we held a few weeks ago with FELNET, through FELNET, in the House of Commons, which was very well attended by a number of important peers and MPs, was of enormous value. And quite a few of those members of Parliament have followed up that contact. We've had further conversations, and so you write this stuff and you never quite know, is anyone taking any notice? I think that FELNET event in London was of huge value. So that was basically the mission. What is really happening with the PA? Does it lack legitimacy? What is it doing about human rights? What about corruption? And what is the consequence of this, not only for Palestinians, but also for the elusive search for a final status peace between Israel and the Palestinians? And so I was trying to address all of those questions through this trip.
You know that the issue has often been raised in the British Parliament, criticising the use of aid and the giving of aid to the Palestinians. And many people have said, we want aid to continue, but we want it spent where it's supposed to be spent, on something meaningful. And this has been quite a major issue. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the impact of PA corruption amongst Palestinians is, and in particular something that you covered extensively, the abuse of human rights by UK and US trained security forces, and the murder of Nizar Banat.
Yes, well, I think this is a crisis that has been building up for a long time. Direct aid to the Palestinian Authority from the UK has more or less ceased in most sectors. We used to give a lot of direct aid, basically just to assist its budget. Then there was a European-wide scheme to which we subscribed until the proportion of GDP that is allocated for UK aid was reduced a year or two ago. And so, which was going on basically health sector and education sector salaries. But there is one area where we still do give an enormous amount of money, which is security force training. And this has been going on since 2008. We supposedly provide training for the Palestinian security forces and also training sort of programs for them, covering issues such as human rights, respect for human rights, and also what is known as gender awareness. And the whole idea is to produce, according to numerous Foreign Office documents, and before that, to Department for Foreign Aid documents, Department for International Development documents, more accountable security forces. There has been for a long time in the Palestinian territory, in the Palestinian Authority territory, a feeling that security forces act with impunity, cannot be trusted, are susceptible to taking bribes, are corrupt in that way, and also often very brutal in their approach to treating suspects. Well, despite all this, we continue to give this aid. It typically runs at about £7 million a year. The US is giving rather more. We, in fact, essentially have designed the training courses at the relatively new Security Force Training Academy in Jericho, which is known rather grandly as a university, the Al-Istiqlal University. And yet, these forces continue to be abusive, coercive, non-accountable. One of the sort of saddest things about my investigation is, when you look at Foreign Office documents, internal reports, which are, available, they're not secret documents, they're public. They keep patting themselves on the back, saying we're doing fantastic work in producing a more professional Palestinian security force, which is aware of human rights abuses. And yet the opposite is true. Now, way back in 2014, I wrote a long article for the Mail on Sunday, looking at the routine use of torture by the security forces in the West Bank. And I included a number of, I worked with a graphic artist illustrating some of the torture methods that were in common use. I was absolutely thrilled to discover during the course of this trip, when I met a leading Israeli lawyer who obtains asylum, tries to use the Israeli courts to get asylum for Palestinians who are fleeing the Palestinian Authority, either because they've fallen out with them politically, or because they're gay, or for some other reason. And he said he'd actually used this article on a number of occasions, in fact, dozens of occasions, appended to petitions in the Israeli Supreme Court and other Israeli courts, and actually succeeded with the use of this article that was, quite well documented, in getting people protection and asylum. We saw, of course, recently the horrific kidnap and murder of a gay man from Israel who had sought asylum under this system, and even then he wasn't safe. They took him back and murdered him. So it's clearly very necessary. But the thing is this: in the course of researching that article, I interviewed a very senior Palestinian security official who basically boasted about how he used torture and said, well, of course, it's the only way to get the truth out of people. It's essential. And described the torture methods over which he had presided. Indeed, he had supervised people who had committed acts of torture. Well, I interviewed the same official while researching the new series of articles for the JC last summer. We met in a rather smart restaurant in Ramallah, and he's now been promoted to a more senior position. He works quite closely with British officials. I've got to be very careful. I can't reveal his identity. But he continues to say, well, of course, we're told that we shouldn't be using these methods. But the fact is, we do it. We know we do it. Everyone turns a blind eye. It's just how the job is done. Now, this really all came to a head last year, in the June of last year, when a man called Nizar Banat was killed in the most astonishing way. Now, Nizar Banat, this should be a huge story. I mean, the name of Nizar Banat should be, emblazoned across the heart of anybody in the world who cares about human rights in the Middle East. But outside, a fairly select group, he's a relatively unknown figure. The fact is, for a number of years, he had been leading a vociferous and well-organized campaign, partly on social media, partly on the streets, to campaign for essentially legality, democratic accountability, and the respect for human rights in the territory controlled by the PA. And in fact, although Abbas, of course, cancelled the elections that had been due last year, he would have been the head of a party list that would have contested the Palestinian parliamentary elections under a human rights and accountability banner. Well, the truth is, he had 700,000 followers on Facebook. He had more on YouTube. His videos were becoming ever more influential. And somebody in the PA just decided he had to be silenced. So what happened was that after various warnings, which included the firing of live ammunition at his family home while his wife and children were there, he was dragged from his bed in the middle of the night near Hebron. He was bundled into a car, and when he arrived he was brutally beaten before he was bundled into the car, but by the time he arrived at the Preventive Security Force organization headquarters in Hebron, he was dead. In fact, the evidence suggests that he died from a combination of inhaling his own blood, from having pepper sprays sprayed into his mouth at point blank range and causing lacerations, and having been knelt on, much like George Floyd was. He is, in a sense, the Palestinian George Floyd. His death caused a huge outbreak of protest. There was anguish and anger on a vast scale across the West Bank. Thousands upon thousands of people took part in demonstrations against his death. Week after week, it went on late into the year, for a good many months. And these demonstrations themselves were brutally repressed. And I interviewed, for example, a young female lawyer who was arrested and assaulted sexually because she had tried to defend people wrongfully accused of crimes for taking part in protests against the death of Nizar Banat. Eventually, after a sort of sham cover-up of an initial investigation, there was a proper investigation, and 14 people who were members of the Preventive Security Organization, including a colonel, were arrested and charged with his murder. And they were briefly held in custody, but then they were let go in early July of this year on the grounds that they might catch COVID in jail. One of them had already arranged a rather grand wedding for the following weekend after their release, which took place attended by most of the other members of this gang. And they remain free, and there really is now no sign that they will ever be put on trial. So there is no accountability in that sense either. There's no criminal accountability of what amounted to a death squad. Now, that death squad had effectively been trained and financed by the United Kingdom. United Kingdom taxpayers had sponsored the formation and training of a death squad, which murdered the West Bank's leading campaigner for democracy and human rights. I don't have to really underline just how serious that is, that a gang of that kind can operate with such impunity. I believe he had 42 separate injuries. The violence that was applied to him, I can just give you one illustrative fact. 5 of his ribs were snapped where they joined his chest bone, his sternum. You imagine the force that must have been applied to him to make that happen. So, I mean, this was a savage murder, and yet, A, it remains unknown, and B, there seems to be really no change in the way in which either the United Kingdom or indeed the rest of the international community continues to view the Palestinian Authority and the security apparatus which it commands. It's fair to say that when Joe Biden visited Bethlehem and met President Abbas in July, he did make a very brief mention about the need to improve accountability and professionalism in the security forces, but it was the briefest of mentions. Meanwhile, you know, this elusive search for the two-state solution continues, and the international community continues to regard the Palestinian Authority as the prospective partner for peace. This is really a bit like Kuwait is saying, well, let's see if we can negotiate with Saddam Hussein and his regime to try and negotiate a lasting peace. It's on a par with that. And frankly, you know, I think there's a sort of delusional, magical thinking going on here. How can you have a lasting democratic settlement, or a lasting settlement that has democratic support, when the PA is now maintaining itself in power using methods such as this?
Well, has this had an impact in terms of other human rights campaigners, and has it squashed that kind of protest? Because it must be very frightening for anybody who is campaigning in the way Mr. Bennett did. It also reminds me somewhat of the Khashoggi murder in Turkey, and yet we've heard so little of this murder. What impact has this had now that the demonstrations have stopped? Has anybody else campaigning in the way he did?
Yes, there are signs of campaigns. There is a growing sort of underground internet-based opposition channel, if you like. There's, for example, a channel called Mishhek, which I think means this is not how you do it, or you know, this is not good enough, which is available on I think Telegram and various other internet channels as Instagram and so forth. And this publishes a lot of very anti-PA news. It carries out little investigations into corruption. Of course, it's all anonymous. Palestinian journalists operating in the open face severe threats of reprisal and considerable danger if they challenge the authority openly. So there's that. And there are signs of other organizations beginning to occupy the space that Nizar Bannat and his movement did occupy. There's one called Enough is Enough, led by a man called Yasser Abed Rabdo. And there is also, there are one or two other sort of organizations which are essentially the old Palestinian left, you know, the descendants of organizations which probably owe their origins to the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which of course, you know, raises some issues, troubling issues of their own, which we need not go into at this point. So yeah, there is a great deal of dissatisfaction, but of course, you know, to get too organized is to take a big risk. Oh, and there are also lawyers' organizations. I mean, lawyers are often bearing the brunt of this sort of thing. I've mentioned the young woman I interviewed, but those problems have certainly not gone away. And yeah, there's activity, but people do have to be very careful.
Yeah. Could we turn now to some of the other forms of corruption that you unearthed? I'm thinking particularly around health facilities, or funding for health facilities. The bribes for treatment, the ghost hospitals. Could you talk us through that?
Yes. So I mean, with the human rights side, I mean, what I was essentially doing was investigating a story that kind of challenges the conventional narrative. The conventional narrative in most of the Western media, you know, is Israelis bad, Palestinians good, and nuance doesn't bear too much. It doesn't have too much of a role in that. And it's the same when you look at corruption. So if you take health, it's quite a commonly reported story that sometimes Israel has made it difficult for Palestinians who have serious conditions, serious life-threatening illnesses, to get treatment in Israeli hospitals, which are better funded sometimes and better equipped. And this is, you know, it's a common sort of trope in media coverage. Well, the first issue I was looking at was how in many cases, it has become routine and institutionalized that Palestinians who want such treatment, or who also want treatment in Palestinian private sector hospitals, have to pay bribes to PA officials to get that. And that applies not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, where the Palestinian Health Ministry continues to basically control the list that decides whether or not you get on that sort of permit transfer list. Now, one of the most moving and heartbreaking interviews I've done was with a young woman who was in a Jerusalem hospital, who was receiving treatment for bowel cancer, although she was very young, getting chemotherapy. And there had been a 6-month delay in her treatment because her family couldn't afford to pay the bribe. Eventually her father, who did have good connections amongst the Fatah leadership in Ramallah, although they were in Gaza, was able to get strings pulled. But you know, that 6 months may well have had very serious consequences, that delay in her treatment. I was also able to speak on the phone to her uncle, somewhat older man who was still in Gaza, very, very ill man. Unfortunately, he has cancer too, different kind of cancer, and he was clearly in very bad shape, and he just couldn't get on that list at all because he didn't have the money and he didn't have the connections. I spoke to other people in the hospital, people sort of sitting in the grounds getting their chemo on a sunny day. It's quite a curious thing. They're sitting at tables under nice sort of shady trees with drips in their arms, getting chemotherapy. And I spoke to other patients too who didn't want to give their names, and they'd had the same experience. They'd had to pay bribes to get on that list. So that was one aspect of the corruption. Well, I also managed to find a whistleblower near Hebron, a man called Dr. Haitham al-Hidri. Now, Dr. Haitham al-Hidri very bravely went on the record, allowed himself to be photographed, and he's obviously, from his title, he's a physician himself, quite an experienced senior physician, and he was actually asked by the Palestinian Health Ministry to clean up the corruption in the Palestinian health sector. Well, he was too good at his job. He started naming and shaming officials who were taking bribes, and indeed recommending that they should be sacked. And he also started saying that often patients could be treated in public hospitals in the Palestinian territories because they did have the facilities, but because there was so much money to be made from the private sector, there was this huge drain on the Palestinian Authority health budget, getting people treatment in private hospitals, which wasn't necessary if they happened to have the clout and the connections or had paid the bribes. So he started to expose all this after in a period of over a period of about 2 years, and then was abruptly fired. He was transferred from his job, and I think he's still getting a salary, but he's sort of sitting, kicking his heels in Hol near Hebron. So he was pretty disappointed. But what made it even more extraordinary was that not very far from where he lives is a brand new hospital. And it's built using Italian aid, and it's superb. I mean, it's a beautiful state-of-the-art facility serving an area which doesn't have any other public hospitals. It's got a lovely sort of stone facade, and excellent laboratories and air conditioning, spotlessly clean, and there are no patients. Well, I think on the day I visited, there are 104 beds, and there were just 4 that were occupied. And this is because, according to Dr. Hidri, and indeed other Palestinian health analysts who I spoke to, it's because of this channeling of resources into the private sector where there's big money to be made, as opposed to, you know, the equivalent of the National Health Service for Palestine. And then the final issue, the final thing I looked at was the failure to construct a swanky is not quite the right word, a state-of-the-art cancer hospital in Ramallah, which was launched, a project that was launched amid great fanfare a few years ago with President Abbas and other senior officials, appealing for funds. And it was going to be this wonderful 300 and something bed hospital with every conceivable type of treatment for cancer available, a state-of-the-art facility in the heart of the West Bank. Well, what there is now is a big hole in the ground. And instead, what has actually happened is that a private hospital is building a somewhat smaller facility. And of course, this will require people to pay to be treated or to pay the bribes to get the authority to pay for it. So, this corruption is reflected in different ways, but none of them are good for the public health of Palestinians.
It's interesting, isn't it, that we've seen very little focus on this kind of corruption. We've seen quite a lot, mainly due to some fantastic campaigns around educational books, the curriculum, the naming of school buildings, but very little on this. But just recently we saw quite a focus from some frontbench Labour politicians suggesting that the problem for Palestinians getting treatment was that the Israelis would not issue passes for them to get out and get that treatment. This really throws some shade on that, doesn't it?
Well, I think it does. Yeah, I mean, there was one particular MP who did indeed suggest that the problem was the Israelis. Look, I can't say hand on heart that the Israelis never do cause problems, and I can't say that there are not cases where people who deserve treatment, who don't pose a security threat, who don't have any real reason not to get that treatment or not to be admitted into Israel, are denied it. But what is clear is that there is another dimension to this, and I mean the one thing that I was picking up from the people I interviewed who had been asked to pay bribes is that once the PA officials put you on that list, often it's quite quick to get that referral, to get to Israel and get the treatment. So, again, I can't say hand on heart that there are never delays, but certainly in some cases, it seems that once you're on the list, the Israelis say, fine, great, come over. So yes, there is another much more complex side to this, and because it doesn't fit the conventional narrative, it gets very little attention.
Mm-hmm. And for us, in terms of trying to get a more balanced debate and normalise the rhetoric around these issues in the British Parliament, this research is very, very important. Can I move to what your third piece was about, which is seen as quite controversial among some, but is a really important issue. It's the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the PA. Why is this a barrier to peace? And the day after Abbas dies or steps down, what then? And I don't know if people can see, oh, probably not. This was your front page. But what it actually says is the Palestinian Authority is dead. Long live what? Do you want to talk us through that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that the PA commands very little support amongst Palestinians. And I would say that I think if you did similar surveys in Gaza, you'd find that very few Gazans support Hamas too. The same is true there. And I haven't looked into Gaza. I've been in the past, but not for the purposes of this investigation. Transparency International rates Palestine, the Palestinian territory is one of the worst in the region. They discovered in 2019 that I think it was a fifth of all Palestinians had to either pay bribes or use political connections, what is sometimes referred to as wasta in Arabic, to get what should be widely, freely available public services. Recently, Mahmoud Abbas designated Hussein al-Sheikh, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, as his designated successor. Hussein al-Sheikh is an extremely rich man. He has a large office tower with his name on it in downtown Ramallah, much like Donald Trump's tower in New York. Quite how he's acquired this wealth while serving as a public official over the years is not quite clear, but certainly people do have their suspicions. And the thing is that according to opinion surveys after his designation as Abbas's successor as PA president, precisely 3% of Palestinians thought this was a good idea. So it's clear that there is a crisis of legitimacy. Now, as you all know, at Camp David and at Taba, very generous offers were made by Israel to Yasser Arafat, and they were ultimately rejected. In 2008, Ehud Olmert made an even more generous offer to Mahmoud Abbas, which included a deal for Jerusalem, which would have led to Jerusalem becoming an internationalized city and large-scale land for peace swaps. This too was rejected. Well, it is an open secret in the West Bank that the main reason why neither Arafat nor Abbas could succeed in persuading people or could accept such deals was that they feared that they'd be assassinated the next day if they did, because they would not have the legitimacy to persuade Palestinians to support a final status settlement of that nature, even despite the apparent Israeli generosity that was on the table at that point. Now, clearly that affects any assessment of the future prospects for peace. And indeed, Biden was suggesting on his visit earlier in the year that this is not the time for final status negotiations. This is, I think, a very realistic assessment. But the thing is, I've been going to the Palestinian territories quite often now for the last 15 years, and what I detect is just a weariness, a growing sense that there's never going to be a deal, because with the PA in power as it is, it just can't ever work. And there was a lot of skepticism when I first went. Now there's just like, what? Are you serious? A deal with the Israelis negotiated by Abbas and his crew? It's not going to happen. And at the same time, Abbas is 87 years old. His father did live to the age of 106, but he's a chain smoker and not in fantastic health. And there is going to come a point where he's going to go to the great Mokata, the presidential palace in the sky, or he's going to step down. And then what? And really nobody talks about what happens the day after Abbas dies or goes. There is no realistic successor who can command support. Some people look at the tribalism of the Palestinian territories and they say, well, there's going to be a sort of internecine tribal war. And I spoke to tribal leaders who said, well, yeah, we're amassing guns. We do not want people we don't like from the next governorate or city coming in here and telling us what to do. And if they try to, we'll shoot them. And indeed, I spoke to one influential tribal leader in Hebron who said that he thought that there were twice as many weapons held in caches, just ordinary families in his clan, the Jafari clan, the Jabari clan, as there were 2 or 3 years ago. Other people say, well, is there some other savior who can come in and rescue this? And people point to people such as Mohammed Dahlan, now a billionaire or multi-millionaire living in Dubai, the former strongman from Fatah who was driven out of Gaza when Hamas conducted its coup. But again, there are Israelis I know who think that he's the solution. Well, I can't just see that he would ever command support, because he has murdered and tortured people. His people have murdered and tortured people over many years when he was in charge of Fatah and Gaza. So, what does happen the next day? And that next day could be tomorrow. And yet, where's the contingency plan? Where is the international community sitting down and saying, well, what are we actually going to do about this problem? So I think, summing up here, you have a situation where you have an authority that is lacking in legitimacy, which is maintaining itself in power with methods which are not dissimilar to those used by Saddam Hussein, which is completely corrupt, which has seen the circle around Abbas become incredibly wealthy. And yet the international community indulges what I can only call a sort of magical thinking. This is what we've always done. We support this two-state solution along these lines, worked out along the lines first conceived at Oslo. Well, that's what we do. So that's what we do with Middle East peace. Well, maybe that's better than nothing, but actually I'm not sure that it's better than nothing, because what it actually does is raises false hopes It certainly isn't good for Israel, because it allows Israel to get away with, not addressing the issue seriously. If, of course, there are Israelis who really don't want a final status solution, but those who do are not going to get anywhere while that remains the prevailing international wisdom. So I don't pretend I have solutions in my back pocket, but I think what I hope I've done in the course of this investigation is to raise serious issues that will let people think a little bit more critically and rigorously and say, well, is it time for a complete reassessment of the way we approach this? Maybe there's a way of reforming the PA. Maybe there's a way of stopping the security forces from torturing people. But, just saying, well, we invest in human rights training and gender awareness ain't it. And equally, we do actually, as the British, give a small amount of money to an anti-corruption organization based in Ramallah. But again, it's clearly not working. Because by and large, the Palestinian territories do remain corrupt.